Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get straight into complex source material, grab the key insights, and basically get the shortcut to being really well informed.
That's the goal.
And today we're doing a pretty critical deep dive. We're looking at one of the most foundational and, yeah, let's be honest, controversial sections of modern scripture.
Doctrine and Covenants, section 132.
Exactly. DNC 132. Now, this text is just crucial because it's essentially the theological bedrock for the Latter-day Saint doctrine of eternal marriage, and specifically plural marriage.
You really can't understand the history or the theology without grappling with this section.
Absolutely. So our mission today, it's very specific, very laser focused. We're tackling a particular argument, one put forth by Michelle Stone in her really detailed analysis, 132 problems, revisiting Mormon polygamy.
A significant work on the topic.
It is. And Stone argues, pretty forcefully, that DNC 132 contains what she calls a glaring factual error right there at its core. An error, she says, really undermines the text's authority, especially when it talks about ancient practices.
And this error revolves around a specific figure.
Yes. The central issue here, it really hinges on the Old Testament patriarch Isaac. You know, Abraham's son.
Right, the middle patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
Precisely. And DNC 132 asserts quite plainly that Isaac was commanded by God to practice polygamy, and therefore that he was a polygamist.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is rigorously compare that claim, that modern assertion, against the actual record. The detailed, meticulous record of the Bible, specifically Genesis, which, as you know, gives us an almost exhaustive biography of Isaac.
Exhaustive is a good word for it. The level of detail is quite remarkable for an ancient text.
It really is. Okay, so let's unpack this claim. Let's see where the scriptural evidence maybe breaks down, and crucially what that breakdown might mean for the revelation itself.
And I think it's important right at the outset for you, the listener, to understand why this matters. This isn't just, academic nitpicking or finding some obscure footnote.
No, not at all.
When a modern text comes along, claims divine authority, and explicitly uses previous established scripture, the Bible, in this case, to justify a new and pretty radical doctrine, well, its accuracy regarding those original sources becomes non-negotiable.
It's about credibility, fundamentally.
Exactly. It's about credibility. We're looking at a potential, maybe even profound, scriptural contradiction here. If DNC 132 actually misrepresents the life of a central biblical figure like Isaac, someone everyone knew, well, that error raises some massive questions.
Huge questions about the overall divine authenticity that's claimed for the revelation. It's not a small thing.
Not at all.
Okay, so before we jump into the critique, let's be really precise about the source text itself, DNC 132. Where exactly does it make this assertion about Isaac? Because, if we're going to challenge it, we have to accurately state the claim first.
Absolutely. Foundational fairness. The claim is, well, it's pretty central to the section's whole argument. It's trying to establish historical precedent, a divine mandate for plural marriage.
Setting the stage.
Right. So DNC 132, verse 1, it kicks off with the Lord stating he's going to reveal the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, and yeah, that includes plural marriage.
Okay, so that's the setup.
But the real kicker, the verse that directly implicates Isaac, is DNC 132.37. This verse explicitly groups Isaac right alongside Abraham and Jacob.
The big three.
The big three. As examples of men who weren't just plural husbands, but who were commanded by God to be so, and therefore they were justified in it.
Okay, can you give us the specific wording there? Because that sounds pretty definitive.
It is. The text says, let me find the exact part. Abraham received concubines, and they bore him children, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. Go ye, therefore, and do the works of Abraham. Enter ye into my law, and ye shall be saved. Then it mentions Abraham being commanded to offer Isaac, points out that it was despite the command, thou shalt not kill, and says Abraham was righteous for not refusing.
Right, establishing the principle of obedience over standard rules.
Exactly. Then it continues, now as pertaining to the priesthood, there are many things commanded of my servants, which are not written in my book. Nevertheless, they have done them, and I, the Lord, justified them. And then comes the crucial part. And as pertaining to the new and everlasting covenant, it was instituted for the fullness of my glory, and Isaac also and Jacob did it, and they have entered into their exaltation according to the promises.
Wow. Isaac also did it.
Did it.
That is explicit. There's no ambiguity there. The verse clearly implies Isaac did it, meaning he practiced plural marriage just like his father Abraham and his son Jacob, and was justified in doing so as part of this covenant.
That's the plain reading. It lumps them right in.
Okay. But here's where Michelle Stone comes in. She argues that when you actually compare that assertion to the primary source, the detailed source, Genesis, well, she says there's zero scriptural evidence. Absolutely none.
Zero.
To support the idea that Isaac was a polygamist, in fact, she points out everything the biblical record does say seems to contradict this claim completely.
And that's a strong claim, not just lack of evidence, but contradictory evidence.
Exactly. And the potential magnitude of this error, if it is an error, really can't be overstated, can it?
No. Think about it. We're talking about a claim attributed to God in a modern revelation that directly contradicts a core narrative fact about one of the most studied figures in the entire Old Testament.
Yeah, Isaac isn't some minor character hidden in genealogies.
Not at all. So this isn't just a minor theological squabble over interpretation. It's presented as a factual contradiction of the historical record as we have it preserved in the Bible.
Now, I have to step in here and play devil's advocate for a second. Because this is the first place an apologist, someone defending D&C 132, would likely go.
Sure. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence argument.
Right. They'd argue, look, just because the Bible doesn't explicitly mention Isaac having other wives, that doesn't automatically mean it didn't happen. Maybe the Bible simply failed to record them. Just like maybe D&C 132 implies the Bible also failed to record God explicitly commanding Abraham's and Jacob's polygamy, even though they practiced it. Isn't that a possibility? A reasonable way out?
It sounds reasonable on the surface. It's a common defense mechanism for scriptural difficulties. But it requires you to accept an enormous and, frankly, incredibly convenient omission.
Convenient how?
Convenient because it plugs the hole in the D&C 132 argument.
Oh.
But it ignores the nature of the biblical text we're dealing with. Genesis, especially the patriarchal narratives, is almost obsessive about lineage and family structure.
Right. Genealogies are everywhere. Who begat whom?
Exactly. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
They are the absolute pillars of the covenant narrative. Their lives, their marriages, their children, their posterity.
Yeah.
These things are detailed with a meticulousness that's virtually unmatched for that era of Scripture.
Okay.
If Isaac had plural wives, and especially if he had children outside of Rebekah, the entire core purpose of the biblical record in Genesis, which is tracking the covenant line, establishing who belongs, setting up the nation of Israel, it would demand that those wives and children be included.
Why demand?
Because they would have been absolutely essential for things like land claims, tribal identity, political standing, inheritance rights. Everything revolved around lineage. To suggest that such a significant detail, other wives, other potential heirs for the covenant patriarch was simply omitted. It requires you to basically dismiss how the book of Genesis was compiled and what its cultural function actually was. It wasn't just telling nice stories.
So you're saying the Bible wasn't just a religious text, but also functioned as a meticulous family and, in a way, political history record for that lineage.
Precisely. And if it missed something this big about Isaac, of all people, it would have to be like the only instance where it failed so spectacularly in recording such a massive detail for one of the three most important figures.
Okay, so the challenge we're setting up is this. We need to assess the biblical record on its own terms. And if it's as meticulous as you say, then claiming Isaac had unrecorded wives becomes a very, very difficult position to maintain.
Exactly. And as we get into the specifics of Isaac's story in Genesis, I think we'll see just why that kind of omission is not just unlikely, but narratively and historically almost impossible.
All right, let's shift focus now directly to the Bible. Let's look at that story of Isaac and Rebekah, because our sources, like Stone's work, really emphasize the sheer amount of detail the Bible gives to their lives. Their courtship, their marriage, their kids, their struggles.
Yeah.
Apparently more detail than practically anybody else in that section of Genesis.
It's absolutely true. Genesis 24 is this incredible narrative. It's almost entirely dedicated to one thing. The search for Isaac's wife, his one wife.
One wife. That's the focus from the start.
Completely. Abraham sends his most trusted servant, probably Eliezer, on this major journey with incredibly specific instructions. Go back to my homeland, find a wife for Isaac from my own kin. Don't let him marry a Canaanite. The gravity, the importance placed on finding this singular woman is immense.
And the text spends a lot of time on Rebekah herself, doesn't it? It's not just about the servant's quest.
No, it really develops her character. We read about her goodness, her loveliness, her initiative at the well, her kindness to the servant and the camels.
The camel test, right.
The camel test. And her faith and trustful willingness to venture into the unknown. She agrees to leave her family immediately and go marry a man she's never met, based on the servant's testimony. The narrative clearly positions her as chosen not just by Abraham's servant, but by divine providence. The servant even prays for a specific sign, and she fulfills it perfectly.
So the literary structure itself is setting her up as unique, as divinely appointed.
Absolutely. She's presented as the fulfillment of Abraham's mission for his son, the crucial link for continuing the covenant line. The narrative isn't just, reporting facts like he found a girl, they came back. It's building a powerful story around this essential, unique partnership.
Okay, and then there's the moment they actually meet. Genesis 24, the end of the chapter, verses 63 to 67. Our sources describe this scene as having this poetically romantic feel, almost like a scene from a classical romance novel.
It really does. It's worth spending a moment just reading those verses, or at least summarizing them,
Right.
because they're so crucial for understanding the singular nature of this union that the text is portraying.
Go ahead.
Okay, so it says, "And Isaac went out to meditate in the field at the eventide. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, the camels were coming." So Isaac's out there maybe praying, maybe just thinking,
Waiting.
And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she lighted off the camel. She immediately shows respect, maybe a bit of awe. For she had said unto the servant, "What man is this that walketh in the field to meet us?" And the servant had said, "It is my master." Therefore she took a veil and covered herself. Again, modesty, propriety. Then the servant fills Isaac in, and the servant told Isaac all things that he had done. Mission accomplished.
And then the conclusion.
Right here. "And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her."
Yeah.
And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death.
Wow. That's a very neat, very powerful narrative arc right there. Servant reports, Isaac takes her, she becomes his wife, he loves her, finds comfort, boom, done.
Exactly. And notice the specific detail. He brought her into his mother Sarah's tent.
Yeah, I noticed that. What's the significance there? That seems specific.
It's huge. It signifies that Rebekah is immediately stepping into the primary matriarchal role. She is the direct and sole replacement for Sarah, the original matriarch of the covenant. She's filling that unique singular void left by Isaac's mother.
So she's not just a wife, she is the wife.
Precisely. She is the wife who provides the comfort, the continuity, the legitimacy for the next generation of the covenant. Now imagine if at this exact moment Isaac already had another wife, maybe a concubine, maybe a lesser wife, waiting back in another tent somewhere.
It would completely undercut the scene.
Completely. The
Yeah.
power, the romance, the theological weight of him bringing her into Sarah's tent, loving her, being comforted by her, it all just collapses if she's not unique.
Okay, that makes sense. And that really brings us to this literary analogy that the source material, like Stone's work, suggests. If the Bible is deliberately framing this as a singular foundational love story, then an unmentioned plural wife doesn't just seem unlikely, it actually kind of destroys the structural integrity of the narrative itself.
Think about it in terms we might relate to more easily today. Imagine reading Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The whole tragedy hinges on their forbidden, all-consuming love for each other.
Right.
Now, imagine if, like, halfway through Act 3, some minor character just casually mentioned, "Oh yeah, Romeo's got another girlfriend back in Mantua." Shakespeare just didn't bother putting her in the main story.
It would make no sense. The entire premise is ruined.
Or think about Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice. The entire plot revolves around the slow burn, the misunderstandings, the eventual coming together of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy.
The classic.
Now imagine finding out, maybe in a footnote somewhere, that actually Mr. Darcy was already legally married to someone else the whole time, living on another one of his estates, and Jane Austen just forgot to mention it.
It changes everything. The entire conflict, the social rules they're navigating, the romantic tension, the payoff, it's all built on the premise that these are two single individuals whose potential union is the central focus.
And that is precisely what our sources argue is happening in Isaac's story in Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
The narrative immediately moves from that romantic meeting into the next major plot point, their painful 20-year struggle with infertility.
20 years, that's a long time.
A very long time. Genesis 25, verse 21 spells it out. "And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived."
Okay, wait. If the whole point, according to the later D&C 132 interpretation, is to multiply and replenish the earth, fulfill the Abrahamic covenant of numerous posterity, and Isaac supposedly had been commanded to practice polygamy, Why on earth would he wait 20 years praying for Rebekah specifically to conceive?
Exactly. If he had other wives or even the mandate to take other wives.
He wouldn't need to entreat the Lord for Rebekah's barrenness for 2 decades. He could have just, had children with another wife to fulfill the be fruitful and multiply aspect, especially since he's carrying the crucial covenant lineage. Why the 20-year wait centered only on her?
That, right there, is maybe the strongest narrative proof of Isaac's focus on a singular marriage. If he had another wife, his ability to produce posterity wouldn't have been the central crisis driving the narrative forward for 20 years. The tension of Rebekah's barrenness, which sets up the whole miraculous birth story of the twins, Esau and Jacob, would be completely moot.
So the story requires her to be the only one for the drama to work.
The focus is squarely on Rebekah, her struggle, Isaac's prayer for her, and the subsequent divine intervention through her. This narrative structure strongly demonstrates that the divine plan, at least in Isaac's generation, required the heir, the continuation of the covenant, to come specifically through that single covenant relationship with Rebekah.
And the Bible doesn't stop there, does it? After the twins are finally born, the text keeps giving us really granular details about this family.
Oh yeah, we get descriptions of the twins, Esau, the hairy outdoorsman, Jacob, the quiet tent dweller. We get the unfortunate parental favoritism, Isaac favoring Esau, Rebekah favoring Jacob.
Which leads to all sorts of problems later.
Immense problems. The trickery, the stolen blessing, Jacob having to flee. The text gives us all the messy details of the complex plotting and family dynamics that follow.
So the writers of Genesis seem deeply, maybe even painfully invested in the specific dynamics of this one marriage, Isaac and Rebekah.
Absolutely. And despite all this intimate, decades-long focus on their life together, their struggles, their children, their favoritism, the Bible just never, ever mentions another wife, not a concubine, not even a hint of a second mother for any of his children.
Wow.
The evidence from the narrative structure alone for Isaac's lifetime monogamy seems overwhelming.
Okay, so the narrative itself strongly points to monogamy for Isaac, but there's another massive piece of evidence that our sources bring up against the D&C 132 claim, and it comes down to, well, meticulous record keeping.
Genealogies again.
Genealogies. The argument is that the biblical record, Genesis in particular, goes to great lengths to painstakingly record the members of these patriarchal families, all the wives, all the kids, even the ones who aren't in the main covenant line.
And it's vital we understand why they did this. It wasn't just, for sentimental reasons like a modern family tree. In the ancient Near East, genealogies were legal documents. They proved your covenant standing. They justified your land ownership. They cemented your tribal identity.
So every child mattered, for the record.
Every child born to a patriarch, whether they were destined for the main covenant inheritance like Isaac or excluded from it like Ishmael, was still an economic and political reality. They were part of the family's network, potential allies or rivals, and so they were accounted for.
Okay, and we see this very clearly with Isaac's father, Abraham, right? His record seems quite explicit.
Oh, completely explicit. We know about Sarah, his primary wife. We know about Hagar, Sarah's handmaid, who became a concubine and bore Ishmael. And then later, we know about Keturah. The biblical writers make sure we know who the wives or concubines are and who the children are that come from each union. It's all laid out.
Right. And speaking of Keturah, we probably need to tackle her specifically for a minute, because, as you hinted earlier, polygamy apologists often bring her up, don't they?
They do. It's a common argument. They try to use Keturah to bolster the idea that polygamy was just standard practice, maybe even necessary, for the patriarchs. They often claim she was Abraham's plural wife, living at the same time as Sarah and Hagar.
So the argument goes, see, Abraham was always a polygamist, even with Keturah alongside Sarah. Therefore, it's plausible Isaac was too, even if Keturah wasn't mentioned until later.
Exactly. If they can establish Keturah as a simultaneous plural wife, it lends credence to the idea that maybe Isaac also had an unmentioned plural wife. It makes it seem more historically plausible.
But the source material we're looking at argues this claim about Keturah utterly defies logic when you actually look closely at the Bible's own timeline.
It really does. And we need to be rigorous here, just walk through the sequence of events as Genesis presents them. It's pretty straightforward.
Okay, lay it out for us.
All right. First, Genesis chapter 23. The entire chapter is about Sarah's death and burial. Verse 2 clearly states, "And Sarah died in Kirjath-arba, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her." So Sarah's death is established. Fact 1.
Fact 1, Sarah's dead.
Fact 2, Genesis chapter 24, which we just discussed in detail. That's the story of finding Rebekah for Isaac. And how does that chapter end? With Isaac being comforted after his mother Sarah's death by marrying Rebekah, this firmly places the events of Genesis 24 after Sarah's death recorded in Genesis 23.
Okay, chronological sequence seems clear so far. Sarah dies, Isaac mourns, Isaac marries Rebekah and is comforted.
Right. Now, fact 3. We turn the page to Genesis chapter 25, and how does it begin? Verse 1, this is the crucial verse regarding Keturah. It says, "Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah."
Then again, okay, I have to jump back into that devil's advocate role here just for a second.
Go for it.
Couldn't an apologist argue that then again doesn't necessarily mean chronologically next? Couldn't it mean something like turning now to another topic from Abraham's life, or also Abraham had taken, implying Keturah might have been a secondary wife taken much earlier, maybe even during Sarah's lifetime, and Genesis 25 is just the point where the narrative picks up the story of her lineage. How can we be absolutely certain that then again means after Sarah's death?
That's a fair linguistic point to raise. The phrasing could theoretically be interpreted that way in isolation. However, the overwhelming literary context and the broader structural evidence of Genesis argue strongly against that reading.
How so?
Well, first, the book of Genesis, particularly the patriarchal narratives, generally follows a chronological flow. It focuses on Abraham's main story arc, then transitions to Isaac's, then Jacob's. To suddenly insert a wife and 6 new sons from much earlier, after recording the death of the primary wife Sarah and the marriage and comfort of the primary heir, Isaac, would be really jarring narrative construction. It disrupts the flow.
Okay, it would be weird placement.
Very weird. Second, and perhaps more importantly, look at what the text immediately says after introducing Keturah in verse 1. Verse 2 says, "And she bears him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua, 6 sons."
Right.
Now, if these 6 sons were born during Sarah's lifetime, while Abraham was still figuring out the whole Isaac inherited situation, wouldn't they have been significant figures? Potential rivals to Isaac. Wouldn't Hagar's experience with Ishmael have taught everyone that sons born outside the primary wife created huge complications?
Yeah, you'd think they would have factored into the earlier drama somehow.
Yet the narrative completely ignores Keturah and these 6 sons until after Sarah is dead and buried, after Isaac is married and established as the heir. They only appear on the scene once the primary succession issue is resolved. This strongly suggests they belong chronologically after those events.
So putting it all together, Sarah dies, Gen 23, Isaac marries Rebekah, Gen 24, then Abraham marries Keturah and has more children, Gen 25. That seems to be the most logical, narratively consistent reading.
Exactly. The timeline really demands that Abraham married Keturah after Sarah's death, which means Keturah was a successive wife, taken in his old age, not a simultaneous plural wife living alongside Sarah.
Which means the attempt to use Keturah to normalize polygamy during Sarah's time, and thus make Isaac's supposed polygamy seem more plausible, it just doesn't hold up against a careful reading of the text.
Precisely. The Keturah argument, while common, fails the basic test of chronological scripture. Keturah's story might show Abraham's vitality, his desire to continue founding nations even late in life, but it doesn't prove simultaneous plural marriage after Hagar was sent away.
Okay, so Keturah doesn't help the case for Isaac being a polygamist. Now, let's get back to Isaac himself by looking at his half-brother, Ishmael. The argument here is that if the Bible took the time to detail Ishmael's family, a non-covenant line, it makes the idea that they just skipped over Isaac's supposed plural wives even less believable.
Yes, the level of detail provided for Ishmael is actually quite staggering, and it really reinforces the meticulousness of the record-keeping we were talking about.
What kind of detail do we get for Ishmael?
Well, Genesis 25, right after mentioning Keturah's sons, transitions in verse 12. Now these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid, bare unto Abraham. It even notes that his mother, Hagar, chose an Egyptian wife for him.
Okay.
And then the text gives us a thorough list of his 12 sons. Not just that he had 12, but their names: Nebajoth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah.
Wow, all 12 are named.
All 12. And it explicitly calls them 12 princes according to their nations. It establishes their status, their future significance as founders of tribes.
That is an astonishing amount of detail for a lineage that the main narrative makes clear is excluded from the primary covenant inheritance going through Isaac.
It really is. The text seems determined to account for every branch of Abraham's family tree, covenant or not. Now here's the key comparison. Contrast that staggering detail about Ishmael's 12 sons and their future as princes with the parallel account of Isaac's family.
Which comes immediately after Ishmael's list.
Immediately after, Genesis 25, verse 19 begins. And these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac.
Yeah.
And then goes on to talk about Isaac's age when he married Rebekah and her background.
Okay, so if Isaac had multiple wives and, say, 12 sons from them, mirroring Ishmael, this would be the expected place in the text to list them, right?
Yeah.
Right after listing Ishmael's 12.
Absolutely. The structure sets up a parallel. Here are Ishmael's generations, boom, 12 named sons. Now here are Isaac's generations, and what do we get?
Just Rebekah.
Just Rebekah. It mentions only Rebekah, his one wife, and then it mentions their struggle with infertility, and finally the birth of their two sons, Esau and Jacob. No other wives are mentioned, no other children are listed.
So no parallel list of 12 princes for Isaac.
None whatsoever. The narrative immediately shifts away from genealogy into the complexities of that singular marriage, Isaac and Rebekah, and the birth order and rivalry of their two sons. The absence of a parallel list of wives and sons in Isaac's case, especially when compared directly to his father, Abraham, and his half-brother Ishmael, is just about the clearest possible structural evidence you could ask for, pointing towards Isaac's monogamy.
It's an argument from silence, but a very loud silence given the context.
A deafening silence,
Yeah.
structured right into the text. And there's one more piece of final confirmation that the source material points to, found much later in Genesis.
Okay, what's that?
It's in Genesis 49, verse 31. This is much later, when Jacob is old and dying, and he's giving instructions for his own burial in the family tomb, the cave of Machpelah.
The ancestral burial plot.
Right. And Jacob is recalling who is buried there. He says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah.
Huh. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, pairs.
Exactly. The focus is on the core covenant couples. One man, one wife, buried side by side in the most sacred family burial place. If Isaac had another significant wife, another matriarch of his household who bore him children, wouldn't this be the moment to acknowledge her alongside Rebekah in the ancestral tomb?
You would think so, especially if she was part of fulfilling the covenant. But nope, just Isaac and Rebekah.
Just Isaac and Rebekah. It seems the scriptural record, from the detailed courtship narrative through the infertility struggle, the meticulous genealogies and lack thereof for Isaac, right down to the final burial record, is just ironclad. It's built on structural evidence, chronological evidence, and narrative evidence, all pointing consistently in one direction. Isaac was monogamous.
Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time establishing what seems like an overwhelming historical case, based purely on the biblical record itself, that Isaac had only one wife, Rebekah.
The evidence is pretty compelling when you lay it all out.
Right. So now we need to pivot. Let's talk about the theological implications of this. Because this isn't just about correcting a historical footnote. It hits right at the core of the justification given for polygamy in D&C 132.
Exactly. This is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, really problematic for the traditional defense of D&C 132.
So let's start with that defense. What was the central theological justification used by early LDS leaders, the one embedded in D&C 132, for practicing and commanding plural marriage?
The absolute core argument, the one repeated over and over, was that polygamy was a divine necessity. It wasn't just permitted, it was required to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant.
And specifically, which part of the covenant?
Specifically, the promise of numerous descendants, the promise that Abraham's seed would multiply as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is upon the seashore, or sometimes as the dust of the earth.
So the interpretation was literal and quantitative. More wives equals more children faster equals fulfilling the promise of multitude.
That was precisely the interpretation. You need as many wives as possible, functioning essentially as breeders, to produce the sheer numbers God had promised. Polygamy was seen as the required social mechanism, the necessary work, the law you had to obey to achieve that promised blessing of numerous posterity.
Okay, so polygamy equals covenant fulfillment through multiplication.
That was the equation. And this equation, this perceived necessity, gave rise to another really important concept, one used frequently to justify why God would ask people to do something as socially disruptive and, for many, morally difficult as polygamy.
Which is?
The idea of the Abrahamic test.
Oh, right, like Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac.
Exactly. The concept suggests that God sometimes requires his most faithful followers to perform acts that seem counterintuitive, that go against normal human morality, maybe even acts that feel repugnant, like taking plural wives in a monogamous society. Why? To prove their ultimate obedience and faith in him, overriding their personal feelings or societal norms?
So the test justifies the difficult commandment.
It does. And our sources, like Stone's analysis, make a really critical observation here. This specific concept of the Abrahamic test, the idea that God routinely demands morally questionable acts simply to prove obedience, isn't actually a prominent feature in standard Judeo-Christian theology outside of the unique case of Abraham and Isaac.
Really? It's mostly found within Mormonism.
It's found almost exclusively within the theological framework developed specifically to justify 19th century Mormon polygamy. It arises directly from the need to explain why God would command something so controversial.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. The justification theology might be unique to the practice it's justifying.
It seems so. But here, and this is the absolute crux here, is where Isaac, the monogamist Isaac, completely dismantles that entire foundation, both the necessity of polygamy part and the Abrahamic test justification for it.
How does Isaac dismantle it?
Because Isaac, the man we've just established, had only one wife, Rebekah, and only two sons, and really only one covenant birthright son, Jacob. This same Isaac was given the exact same promise of infinite posterity as his father Abraham.
Wait, say that again. Isaac received the same stars of heaven promise, even though he was monogamous.
Absolutely, unequivocally. God speaks directly to Isaac in Genesis chapter 26, verse 4. Listen to the language. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed.
Wow. Multiply as the stars of heaven. That's identical language to the promise given to Abraham.
Identical. No conditions attached. No command to take more wives first. The full unconditional promise is renewed directly to Isaac the monogamist.
Okay. If that's true, then the entire rationale that polygamy was necessary to fulfill the covenant, it just evaporates, doesn't it?
Completely.
And if polygamy wasn't necessary, then the whole need for an Abrahamic test to justify why God commanded this difficult, necessary thing also seems to evaporate.
You've got it. Isaac's life, as recorded in Genesis, exposes a fundamental flaw, perhaps a massive misunderstanding, in the theological premise used to justify polygamy in D&C 132. If the covenant promise could be given, and presumably fulfilled, through a man with only one wife and one covenant son, then polygamy wasn't the mandatory mechanism.
So what does that do to the interpretation of the multiply promise itself? It can't just be about sheer numbers produced quickly through multiple wives if Isaac gets the same promise.
It forces a reinterpretation.
Yeah.
It strongly suggests that the promise of multiplying as the stars of heaven wasn't primarily about the physical speed or volume of reproduction in any single generation, requiring, turning patriarchs into studs and women into breeders and harems.
Right.
Instead, it seems the promise was about the divine guarantee of that lineage's continuity and eventual vastness over immense stretches of time. It was about God's commitment to sustaining and multiplying that chosen line, generation after generation, regardless of the physical constraints or challenges faced, like barrenness.
So it was about God's power, not man's procreative strategy.
Precisely. Look at Abraham and Sarah barren for decades. Look at Isaac and Rebekah barren for 2 decades. In both foundational generations, the promise was initially fulfilled miraculously through one covenant wife, despite infertility. Isaac's life proves that faith in God's power to sustain the line, even miraculously if needed, is the true measure of covenant faithfulness in this regard, not how many wives a man manages to accumulate.
And you mentioned Rebekah's barrenness earlier. If God had intended plural marriage to be the default method, the 20 years she was barren seems like the perfect time for him to have commanded Isaac to take another wife.
It would have been the absolutely logical moment, wouldn't it? Isaac, my son, Rebekah is barren, the covenant needs to continue, go take another wife like your father did with Hagar. That would have solved the immediate problem and reinforced the supposed principle of polygamy.
But that's not what happened.
No. Instead, the text says Isaac prayed for Rebekah, and God intervened to make her fertile. The narrative goes out of its way to emphasize the divine sanctity and sufficiency of that single specific union for carrying the covenant forward in that generation.
So putting it all together, not only did Isaac apparently not practice polygamy, but the scriptural narrative seems constructed to demonstrate that God intentionally worked through his monogamous marriage, even overcoming barrenness within it, to ensure the covenant promise was fulfilled through that singular wife, Rebekah.
That's a really powerful way to put it, and I think it captures the most compelling insight from analyzing Isaac's story in this context. Isaac becomes the scriptural exception that completely proves the rule wasn't what D&C 132 claims it was.
He proves the covenant promise can be and was given and fulfilled through a monogamist.
Right. And if the covenant can be fulfilled without polygamy, then the entire argument that polygamy was an eternal, necessary, divinely mandated law for covenant fulfillment just collapses.
Which makes D&C 132's claim that Isaac also did it, meaning practiced plural marriage under command, seem not just factually wrong, but theologically unnecessary and frankly nonsensical, given the actual Genesis account.
It becomes entirely superfluous and directly contradicted by the very scriptures it purports to be clarifying or building upon.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time establishing the contradiction. On one hand, we have the highly detailed biblical record in Genesis, which seems to affirm Isaac's monogamy through narrative, structure, genealogy, and even burial records.
A very consistent picture.
On the other hand, we have Doctrine and Covenants section 132, a text presented as modern revelation, claiming Isaac was commanded to practice plural marriage and did so. The contradiction seems undeniable.
It does. The two positions appear mutually exclusive based on the evidence.
So now I have to tackle the big so what question. Why is this specific contradiction significant? Why does it matter when we're trying to assess the authenticity of D&C 132 as a genuine divine revelation from God?
This is where we need to draw a really clear, sharp line. A line between common, understandable human mistakes, human assumptions, and the kind of mistake we attribute, or rather don't attribute, to divine revelation.
Okay. And human error is, well, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Especially when people are dealing with tradition, memory, and interpreting ancient texts.
Absolutely. And let's be fair. It is a very reasonable human assumption for someone studying the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to just lump them together. You see polygamy with the father, Abraham. You see polygamy with the son, Jacob. It's almost natural pattern recognition to assume the one in the middle, Isaac, must have been the same.
Yeah, you can see how someone could easily make that mistake just based on proximity.
Easily. We see this kind of thing all the time with popular misconceptions that people sincerely believe are straight from the Bible but aren't.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, you mentioned one earlier, the classic, cleanliness is next to godliness, sounds biblical, feels proverbial.
It is not in there. Nowhere.
Nope. Attributed to John Wesley, maybe Benjamin Franklin, but definitely not scripture. Or how about God helps those who help themselves?
Also sounds right, but again, not biblical. More like ancient Greek proverbs, right?
Exactly. Or my favorite example, which we touched on briefly, the image of the peaceable kingdom. Everyone knows the verse says, the lion shall lay down with the lamb. It's in sermons, songs, paintings.
But that's not quite right, is it?
Not quite. If you actually go look up Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6, the actual verse says, the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid.
Wolf, not lion.
Wolf, not lion. Now, is that a huge theological difference? Maybe not. But it's a factual error based on popular tradition and maybe sound-alike mental images. It's a perfectly understandable mistake for any human preacher, writer, or even a religious leader drawing on traditional narratives to make.
Okay, I see the point. These are common human-scale errors in recalling or transmitting information. So the crucial point you're building towards is a human being, maybe Joseph Smith, maybe someone else involved in drafting D&C 132, might understandably have made that same kind of reasonable human mistake, assuming Isaac was a polygamist because his father and son were.
Precisely. That kind of error is entirely plausible within the realm of human fallibility and reliance on assumption or incomplete memory. But then we have to ask the really challenging question. Should a text that purports to be the literal, direct, contemporary word of God, a revelation claiming to unveil eternal truth previously unknown or misunderstood, contain a basic factual error rooted in a common human misconception about established prior scripture?
Yeah, that's a different standard, isn't it?
It has to be. This is the critical distinction. We generally operate under the theological assumption that God's knowledge is perfect. God doesn't rely on faulty memory or common misconceptions. When a divine source cites or references scripture, the expectation is accuracy.
Do we see that consistency elsewhere?
We certainly see it upheld remarkably throughout the New Testament, for instance. Every single time Jesus references the Old Testament using the phrase, "it is written," or similar formulas, when you go back and check the source material he's quoting or alluding to, it is in fact written, and often quoted or referred to with stunning precision, sometimes even revealing deeper layers of meaning.
So divine revelation, by its very nature, is supposed to clarify, illuminate, maybe transcend human misinterpretations or fill historical gaps, not replicate them.
That's the general expectation, yes. When other scriptures believed to be revelation, say the Book of Mormon, or even other sections of the Doctrine and Covenants reference the Bible, they typically aim to enrich, enlighten, add to the understanding, as one commentator put it. They might clarify a passage that was previously obscure or expand on a theological concept hinted at earlier.
But they shouldn't just contradict the basic facts.
But they generally don't simply contradict it in irrational ways with no support or explanation given, especially not regarding a core narrative fact, a biographical detail, in the life of a figure as major and well-documented as Isaac.
And D&C 132's claim about Isaac isn't presented as some subtle reinterpretation, is it? It's stated as a fact. Isaac also did it.
Right. It's a direct assertion of historical fact. And it's not a minor error in interpretation, it's a flat contradiction of the narrative facts presented in Genesis. Accepting the D&C 132 claim essentially requires the reader to discard huge portions of Genesis 24 and 25, the detailed stories of Rebekah's selection and their marriage, as somehow fundamentally incomplete or misleading, without any explanation why.
Okay. So what does that make this error in Isaac?
Well, the sources we're drawing on, like Stone's work, suggest that this makes it a truly substantial error. Not a typo, not a minor misquote, but a significant factual inaccuracy at the heart of the Revelation's justification for polygamy.
And Stone suggests this might even be intentional in a way, like a clue.
Yeah, she uses the intriguing idea that perhaps this kind of glaring factual error might function as a breadcrumb, maybe even a kind of warning sign. A structural flaw that perhaps God allows within a text presented as revelation, precisely to prompt critical thinking, to encourage us not to just accept things blindly, but to do our homework, compare claims, and use our discernment to separate truth from human interpolation or error.
So the error itself becomes a test of critical engagement.
That's one way to look at it. If the very foundation of the justification for polygamy, the claim that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all commanded examples, is built on a demonstrable misunderstanding or misrepresentation of one of those three core patriarchs, well, it logically suggests the entire theological superstructure built upon that faulty foundation might also be flawed.
What superstructure?
The whole concept of polygamy being an eternal, necessary principle commanded by God for exaltation. If the historical precedent cited is inaccurate, the doctrine derived from it becomes questionable.
Okay, so for you, the listener, this really presents a profound choice, doesn't it? There doesn't seem to be an easy way to reconcile both texts as perfectly accurate.
It seems like a binary choice, really. If you choose to accept D&C 132 as perfect, inerrant, divine revelation, then you logically have to conclude that the biblical record in Genesis, despite all its apparent detail and narrative coherence about Isaac, must be either purposefully incomplete on this major point or maybe even actively misleading. You have to privilege the modern revelation over the ancient scripture it references.
Okay, that's option one.
Option two, if you accept the overwhelming detail, the narrative logic, the structural consistency of the biblical record in Genesis regarding Isaac's monogamy, then you have to conclude that D&C 132 contains a serious, demonstrable, factual error regarding a historical claim it uses to justify its central new doctrine.
And in that case, you might question the divine source or the complete accuracy of that section of D&C 132.
Logically, yes. It seems there isn't really a comfortable middle ground where both Genesis and D&C 132.37 can be completely true about Isaac without resorting to some pretty significant intellectual gymnastics or special pleading about unrecorded histories. The contradiction appears direct.
And it's fascinating, too, how accepting Isaac's monogamy, as Genesis seems to portray it, actually makes the life of his son Jacob even more complex and interesting in comparison.
How so?
Well, if Isaac was monogamous, then Jacob's subsequent polygamy with Leah, Rachel, and their handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, doesn't look like the continuation of a mandatory family tradition. It looks more like the exception, maybe driven by Laban's trickery and intense family dynamics.
So Jacob's polygamy becomes the departure, not the norm.
Exactly. And often, if you read the Jacob narrative closely, his polygamous household is framed not as a simple blessing or a smooth fulfillment of the covenant, but as a source of immense tension, jealousy, strife, and struggle.
That's a crucial insight, actually, and something often overlooked in the rush to justify polygamy using the patriarchs. The intense dysfunction in Jacob's household, the wives competing, the blatant favoritism shown to Joseph, the sibling rivalry escalating to the point where brothers sell Joseph into slavery, the outright hatred described between the children of the different wives.
It doesn't paint a pretty picture.
Not at all. It almost serves as a cautionary tale within the scriptural text itself, suggesting that plural marriage, when it was practiced, was often incredibly fraught with difficulty. It wasn't necessarily presented as a straightforward path to righteous fulfillment, but often as a source of profound human drama and pain.
So Isaac's life, in that context, stands out even more.
It really does. It stands as this kind of peaceful, stable, monogamous middle ground, sandwiched between the challenges Abraham faced with Hagar and Ishmael and the intense multi-generational strife that erupted within Jacob's plural family. Isaac's story reinforces that monogamy was not only possible within the covenant, but perhaps even presented as the less tumultuous path. #tagout.
Wow, okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean? Where does this deep dive leave us? I think the main takeaway is pretty stark, isn't it?
It seems fairly clear. The biblical record in Genesis, when examined closely for its narrative detail, its structure, its genealogies, its focus on Isaac's life, marriage, and posterity, it fundamentally contradicts the foundational claim made in Doctrine Covenants, section 132, verse 37, the claim that Isaac was commanded to practice polygamy and did it.
And that contradiction isn't trivial. It places a profound challenge on the perceived authenticity and the claimed divine nature of that specific part of the modern revelation. It strongly suggests that perhaps a common human assumption, a reasonable mistake based on context, may have been enshrined within a text presented as God's direct word.
That's the logical conclusion if you prioritize the consistency and detail of the Genesis account.
So for you, listening right now, we really want to encourage you to take the advice offered by our source material, by analysts like Michelle Stone. Don't just blindly accept long-held traditions or assumptions like the easy assumption that all the main patriarchs must have practiced plural marriage because it became a doctrine later.
Do the work yourself.
Exactly. Take the time to actually open the scriptural source material Genesis in this case. Read chapters 23, 24, 25, 26. Compare the claims made in D&C 132 directly against that original record, chapter and verse. See for yourself if the pieces fit. Engage critically.
And maybe let's end with that final provocative thought, the one we touched on earlier, which really builds directly on this whole issue of Isaac's alleged polygamy being an error.
Go for it.
It's about that Abrahamic test concept again.
Right.
The entire theological justification used to explain why God would command something as difficult as plural marriage. The idea that it was a test of ultimate obedience, overriding personal feelings or societal norms. The justification is severely undermined by Isaac.
How so again?
Well, if Isaac, a clear monogamist according to Genesis, received the full unconditional covenant promise seed as the stars of heaven, without ever being commanded or needing to practice polygamy, then polygamy simply wasn't a scriptural or theological necessity to fulfill that covenant promise.
Meaning the test wasn't necessary because the act wasn't necessary for the stated purpose?
Precisely. The Abrahamic test justification, in this specific context of needing polygamy for posterity, simply didn't exist in Isaac's life, according to the Bible, which raises a really important, maybe uncomfortable question for reflection.
What's the question?
If the core theological concept used to justify a controversial and difficult practice, the idea that God requires morally ambiguous or counterintuitive obedience for covenant fulfillment via polygamy, is itself built upon a fundamental misunderstanding, a factual error, regarding the lives of the very patriarchs it claims to honor. What does that ultimately say about the foundation of the practice itself? Is the justification built on sand?
That is indeed a compelling challenge to consider as you reflect on all this source material. A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us today for this pretty rigorous comparison of Revelation and Record.
And thank you, as always, for diving deep into the material with us. It's complex stuff, but important to wrestle with. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.